Welcome back to another episode of the Changed Physician Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro, and I'm here today with my co-host, Dr. Melissa Cady, and our returning guest, Dr. Dave Draghinas of the Doctors Unbound podcast. And for today, what we're going to be talking about is actually starting a podcast as a physician. Yes. Why would anybody, when we are so overwhelmed with stuff as it is, as being a physician and trying to figure out what to do with life, why would you make that even busier by starting a podcast, and why would you want to? And I can't think of a better guest than you, Dave, to have on for this show today. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, for sure. Why would I want to get more busy and add stuff to my plate, right? And be doing it for like 3 years now. So no, it's awesome. I'm excited to talk to you guys about podcasting.
Well, and we all know that podcasting is the road to immediate wealth and riches, right? You hit the first episode and
Exactly.
Everything starts coming and pouring in, with sponsorships, and people are like paying you thousands of dollars for ads and all this stuff. So obviously, why would anybody want to start a podcast?
Yeah, you just start making it rain really quickly. Mansions and Rolls Royces and Bentleys. It's awesome stuff.
Right, so why don't we just start at the beginning here? And I know we've covered a little bit this in our episode with you, but could you give a recap of why you started podcasting and what you hope by achieving specifically as a physician podcaster?
Yeah, so there's a lot of reasons why physicians should start podcasting, and there's also a lot of reasons why I wanted to start a podcast. Just to kind of, let me just start here. I really believe that what your online presence can be, and probably for a lot of us should be, the new CV. So, and what I mean by that is, you're out on your CV, you're going for a new position or whatever. Oh, I'm a good communicator. Oh, works well with others, blah, blah, blah. Well, when you have something like a podcast, you are basically showing people, you're showing people that you can do something, whether it's your communication skills, whether it's your thought leadership and putting yourself out there, whether it's the actual fact of creating something like that and putting it all together and having it be ongoing for year after year, right? That's you guys know now that is not a small undertaking. I kind of saw that coming a couple of years back. And so I said, rather than talk about being good at something, why don't we show people, and it's so amazing now with media and how a lot of the barriers have come down. I think podcasting is, a great way to do that. And so a few years back, I looked at the media landscape, and, I had started a blog, and I looked at blogging, and there was, 1 billion and one blogs out there. And not to say that you cannot be successful with that. However, the competition is just much greater. I looked at podcasting, and podcasting was up and coming. Not as much competition, but the numbers were growing. And that is still true today. I've been doing this for 3 years. And actually, I've recently was preparing a talk on why doctors should podcast. And I was looking at some of the statistics, and over the last, 5 years or so, you just kind of see a stepwise increase in the amount of people who know about podcasting, who listen regularly. And I think in the physician niche, we're even probably a little bit behind the curve than the general population. So I think there's a massive opportunity for physicians to come into this space and really share with the world what they're passionate about, what their expertise is, etc. So those are kind of the different reasons. For me, with Doctors Unbound, when I started that, I knew when I was talking to different colleagues and hearing about the interesting things that they were doing outside of medicine, that was really a passion of mine, I found. And I really wanted to connect with them. I wanted to communicate with them. I wanted to record that and have it kind of have a repository of that. And I figured that other physicians would be interested too. And, lo and behold, that's kind of come to fruition. And every year and every month, the podcast gains more traction. And we've got an awesome community with Doctors Unbound. I've learned a ton, and I'm so excited that I started on this journey like 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah. I'm wondering, do you find that there's kind of this huge benefit when I think about, the duration of all these social media out there for physicians to, to spread words or ideas, or information, education? It seems like, when we've talked to others too, is that when you are dealing with podcasts or YouTube, when it comes to the ability to search for this information and the longevity of this information, that it's a pretty powerful way of impacting or reaching out to the rest of the world.
Yeah, it definitely is. And like you said, podcasting is different than any other medium because a lot of times people are doing it while, for example, while they're driving or while they're running or something like that. And, most podcasts have something like 80% completion. So if somebody's going to listen to your podcast, they're most likely to finish, if not get through at least 80% of the episode. And, like my podcast will typically run 30, 40 minutes, right? So that's a lot of time that people have with you. They get to know you. They get to hopefully like you. But that's a lot of personal time. And there's a lot of influence that comes from that. And it's very personal, right? So I think in that sense, it's very different than most other social media platforms where everything is like so instantaneous, and it's like the attention span is just shorter and shorter, right? If you don't grab somebody's attention in the first like 3 seconds, and boom, they're off to something else. They're scrolling past you. But podcasting is different. Once somebody clicks play and they start their drive, you've got them for 20 or 30 minutes, and that really is special, and something to be nurtured and not, and really, really developed.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's something about the barrier to entry, which you also talked about, because which is really interesting, I think, with podcasting, because podcasting has been around for like 13, 14 years at least. We not even considering like the radio kind of media before it, but so 2013-ish, I remember people saying at that time how podcasting was the new thing. It seems every year like more and more people are getting into it. And so it's still definitely a growth industry, but the barrier, people get so concerned about, 1,000 different, or millions and millions of different blogs, and there's still thousands and thousands and thousands of podcasts. But as a physician, you can basically use your phone and you can start a podcast. And people, I need this and this and the other thing. Was, well, if you're a physician already, you're a step above a lot of what the content out there is, because you have some degree of credibility. And I do think also from a physician standpoint, what allows you to do then is it amplifies your voice. So, with a change physician, we're always talking about people taking control of their lives and practices in meaningful ways. And if you're frustrated with how health and healthcare is, a podcast really provides you an easy platform to start putting forth the information that you wish your patients, clients, and friends and family members actually knew about. So just knowing that, what was it when you first got started podcasting? What were those first steps that you took to sort of getting in to start the process, and how difficult did you find it to begin Doctors Unbound?
Yeah. So going from idea to actually have a launch podcast actually took me longer than I care to admit. It took a long time. And I'll tell you my personal story. I had started a blog related to anesthesia before that. And, we had talked about doing something similar to Doctors Unbound. I had a partner at the time. And since I had taken the lead with the blog, I thought that this person was going to take the lead with this new venture, which was going to be a podcast. So, both of us got busy professionally in our personal life, and things just kind of sat on the back burner until finally, I said, hey, like, I'm going to move forward with this. It doesn't look like there's any other interest on the other side. So I'm going to kind of take this on. So it took a little while to kind of flesh all that out. And then for me, I was like, this was like 2016-ish. And, so easy, when you're like, in the middle of 2016 to be like, okay, New Year's resolution for 2017, I'm going to start my podcast, right? So kind of push it out into the future, right? I'm kind of thinking about it, doing a little bit of research. But that's kind of how I approached it. And I got to 2017, and here we are in January. And I was like, okay, like, what do I do now? And so like you mentioned, some of the barriers, there's a few more barriers than there are with blogs, because, you've got to figure out the audio. There's some equipment. If somebody's watching on YouTube, you can see we've got a mic with a, windscreen here and a little, suspension lever there. So there's a little bit of equipment. And I think that tends to, trip people up, and it shouldn't, because it isn't that complicated. But people get tripped up a little bit in the mechanics and the process of it. And I was in the same boat. And, if I were to give people advice, I would say, when you're going to figure this out, you're going to pay with one of two currencies. Either you're going to pay with your time, or you're going to pay with money to have somebody else kind of walk you through it. And so I started off with paying with my time, Googling stuff, looking at YouTube videos, and then I would spin my wheels, because I would finish reading that article or watching that YouTube video, and I wouldn't know if this was somebody that I could trust. I would start having second thoughts. Well, I just saw that other article and they recommended such and such microphone. That other article recommended such and such hosting platform. Who should I use? So all this stuff just slows you down when really it isn't even the most important part. The most important part is, figuring out what you're going to podcast about, maybe knowing your format, plotting out like your first 20 episodes, and let's get going. And you can figure out the equipment and get going. But I too got tripped up by all of those things until I took a course, and the course was like my hand holding, and it wasn't cheap. And I've taken multiple courses on podcasting because I've always wanted to be on the cutting edge and know as much as I can. But the course is what walked me through, every step of the way. And it didn't start with the equipment. It was more like starting with getting clear on what my podcast was going to be about. And once I did that, now I could come home after a busy day at the hospital where my brain isn't probably the most creative, and then just sit down and just watch, a 10 to 15 minute video and then implement. It's kind of like you go to the gym and you have a trainer who says, okay, Dave, you're going to bust out 20 reps of this, versus going to the gym and saying, like, what am I going to do today? Mm-hmm. So for me, that's what got me over the hump, is paying for some help.
Yeah. Now, it's interesting about, I did a lot of the, spend time trying to learn it yourself. And I think we've all had different experiences as to what, like, there are people that say you shouldn't edit and spend all that time. Just some people say it's a waste of time, but some people like to edit their own things if they have the time. I guess the question is what's your take on that? Or how quickly would you outsource that to somebody else?
Sure. So I'll tell you what I did. And I think for me, that ended up being a good choice. So I started off the podcast. Obviously, like we alluded to earlier, no sponsorships, starting with no following. So I was trying to, keep cost, lean business, right? I was trying to keep costs as low as I can. And I was doing everything myself. So all of the post-production stuff I was doing myself, the show notes I was doing myself, all of that. I did that probably for about 6 months or so. And I think it was beneficial in the sense that, I learned whether I liked it or not. I didn't enjoy editing. Some people do. And if that's something that you really enjoy, then maybe the cost benefit is there for you. For me, it wasn't. What I found out is that I was so busy working full time with a young family that all of those post-production elements were suffering. I was doing just the bare bones to get by. And I knew that if I wanted to grow, I had to put forth a professional image. So at that point, I found somebody who could take all of that off of my plate, do it better than I could, and slowly started implementing systems and focused more on things that would help my podcast grow and get bigger and kind of, start building on it.
Gotcha.
Well, and I think, kind of tying that together, what you're saying, that you're paying with time or money. One of the advantages is, as a physician, if you're in any practice, you may be time poor, but most of the time I'm going to use the word cash rich. No, you're not rich. No one's, driving their Bentley or whatever, but you're going to have much more cash reserves than somebody who isn't in your typical podcaster. And so I think that's an interesting, or an excellent point that you made, Dave, is the fact that if you start off in such a way to see if you like the media, put some thought into it. And I actually want to return to that in just a second. But then you have the cash to offload all that stuff that other people have to do because they don't have the cash to do it. I mean, if you have a basic physician practice, you should be able to offload to an agency or to a VA or something. And it's not going to bust the bank like it would for somebody who doesn't have a career in medicine. But returning back though to what we were talking about, is when you started your podcast and you started going through your program. I think I'd like to hear your a little bit deeper on that, because you said you started in that class and the things that they focused on, if I was hearing you correctly, was more about deciding your audience, or deciding the specifics about what and why your podcast is. And could you add a little bit of insight there? So yeah, I think people may not even appreciate the fact that really the first step of a podcast is figuring out the what and why.
Yeah, actually, yeah. And that's hugely important. And, you know, you've got to figure that part out. And, you know, probably most lay people thinking about it are thinking, well, I want to cast a very wide net and have, you know, a huge audience, but you're not going to stand out when you do that. Really what you have to do is niche down as you know, as narrow as you can, and figure out who that audience is going to be and what your podcast is going to be about. And then once you figure that out, once you start going, once you kind of dominate and be, you know, take care of that niche, then you can start inching out. But you really need to be clear on that, because, you know, that's who you're going to be speaking to. That's how you're going to create the content. I mean, you know, if you're way too far off wide, you know, how are you going to know what kind of guests to bring on? How are you, if it's a solo episode, how are you going to know the topics that are important to your audience? So you really need to figure out that part first, is, you know, who is your audience going to be? And really, you know, some people get really, really specific, you know, they even name their avatar. You know, for me, my avatar was kind of myself. And so it's like, okay, you know, David is a, you know, 40-something-year-old guy who is mid-career physician. You know, he's got about a 30-minute drive, and he likes to listen to podcasts. He's, you know, feels pretty comfortable at work, but now he's really wanting to know what else is out there in the world of investing and technology and, you know, and all this kind of stuff. And so he's looking for more information and ideas, and, you know, and so you start creating your avatar, and it could be really, really specific like that. You can even name them. And then when you're creating your content, you're kind of, you know, you've got something to you kind of have a mirror, like, you know, is David going to want this kind of content, or is he not really going to be interested? Or, you know, or Melissa, or who, you know, whoever your avatar is. And that's what's really cool about podcasting too, is like you can go really, really narrow and really serve really well this kind of small group of people, you know, centered around whatever topic. And you can be really, really successful monetarily and impact wise for that specific niche. And because, you know, all of these barriers have come down so much with you know, with the cost of entry, you know, that's why we've got, you know, thousands and thousands of podcasts on so many varied and interesting topics.
Yeah. I want to just add on to that a little bit is what people may not know is I actually had a podcast I started in 2013, and it's still sort of, I've done everything wrong with it. So if we ever did the episode on what not to do with the podcast, I could do that one. But the piece of advice that I ignored from my podcasting mentor at the time is exactly what you said. And that was niche down. In fact, what he said was niche down to the place where you're uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. Like you should think this is such a select niche, no one's going to listen to it. And he goes, once you got there, that's where you need to be, because it is the opposite, I think, of what most people think. Like you were talking about this wide thing, but niching for podcasting, just like niching down to a very, very, very specific audience, topic, whatever, is just crucial. And it made it so much more difficult because I ignored that first piece of information. So I hope everybody out there listens to that. Niche down, be very specific.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we've got podcasts now in our Doctor Podcast Network, and I can think of just one of them right now. And the niche is like, you know, and I don't know the rest of it because it's not my podcast, but like early career physicians. You know, it's like focusing on those early career physicians who are transitioning from being a resident or fellow to now being a young attending, and all of the different issues that are relevant to that group of physicians. Because there's a lot of things that are relevant to them, whether it's related to mindset and that, you know, of now being the attending, you know, and all the responsibility and the stress that comes with that, whether it's finances. There's so many finances when you're an early career physician and you're transitioning to finally having an income. You know, I'm sure there's stuff related to contracting and you know, what kind of model are you going to be an employee? Are you going to go into private practice? So even something that you think is so niche down, all of a sudden, when you think about it, there are so many interesting things that are relevant to that group of people. And guess what? You know, when you are providing the deep, thoughtful content, those people are going to gravitate to you in your podcast, right?
Yeah,
absolutely.
You know, I'm, you know, through this process with you doing podcasts for some years now, I'm curious, you know, not just like what you've learned along the way about, you know, podcasting per se, because you're revealing a lot of those nuggets and points of wisdom, but I'm curious if there's things about yourself you've learned along the way that others would find valuable, or maybe consider that there are some intangibles there that throwing you a curveball, but I'm just curious.
Yeah. It's interesting because I say to myself that I value, having a lot of free time and having time to relax and sleep. And then I keep piling more stuff onto my plate. and so sometimes I sit there and I wonder, I'm like, why are you doing this to you? What are you doing this to yourself, Dave? But I think I think it goes a little deeper than that. And if I were looking at myself, even from the time that I was, probably in high school or sooner, I've always had various interests. So I always was, medicine was always interesting to me. I always loved the science and, felt like that's where I could have probably my biggest impact. But I've always been interested in other things. So I always feel like I've been well-rounded. I've loved sports. There was a time when I was fascinated with the World Series of Poker. So I've got like a 15-book poker library, and I was reading everything I could about probability and psychology and poker, and was a somewhat winning player at a cash game for a little while. So I've just found that I've had varied interests, in when I really am passionate about something, I really want to dig in deep and and really explore it and become as expert as I can. And that's something that's happened with podcasting too. It started with the creation of Doctors Unbound, and having done it for 3 years now and connecting with so many physicians, we're now creating this doctor podcast network. And, we kind of pitched the idea, to various physicians, and almost everybody that we pitched it to thought it was, that is a wonderful idea. So we've got something like 15 shows in the network right now. We're going to launch in September. And, a lot of the stuff that we were talking about today on the podcast are a lot of these learning things that, the network will be able to, help other physicians kind of walk through, and kind of get a head start. Because, for some of us that were there, like Kevin, even before me, 2013, some of those things, you're figuring out, and they're not, there isn't anything that's kind of specific to physicians out there. But as more docs get into podcasting, and I'm seeing more and more docs do that, it makes sense for us to have some of these networks and organizations that kind of, are unique to us and kind of help us cross promote each other and help each other out and create shows that are relevant to us. So I'm just excited to be able to be a part of that. And I think part of it, if you were talking about deeper lessons, I think it's just that I've always been curious kind of across different specialties, if you will. And I think there's value in that. I heard the idea of, of stacking skills. And I think, for any physician that's listening out there who's thinking about starting a podcast, when you're starting a podcast, you're going to start stacking your skills, because you already have the expertise that you have in whatever specialty, you've chosen as a physician. Now you're adding onto that a showcasing of your skills with a podcast, your ability to, improve upon your oral communication skills. Let me tell you, like, I am introverted by nature, and the idea of getting in front of a microphone when I started 3 years ago, I used to sweat before every interview, because I was dreadfully afraid of uncomfortable silences, and what was I going to say, and how was I going to transition, and now it's like, okay, here's a roadmap of our questions, and I just love talking to people. So being able to develop your personal communication skills, the type of opportunities that will be offered to you because you have a podcast. I was invited to speak at a medical school because of my podcast. Other people have gotten coaching gigs. They've done consulting. There's so many different things. It really opens up a lot of things for you. So that's kind of my pitch. If you're at all interested, go for it. Just do it.
Kevin?
No, I like that. And I was, because there's, I always look at things like extrinsic and intrinsic motivators and extrinsic and intrinsic benefits. And one of the things that made me think of when you were talking about the benefits that you were finding with podcasting is even outside the potential opportunities that are out there, depending on how things get leveraged in your audience and all that other stuff. At a minimum, as a physician, I can see at least two parts that would make sense. If you're doing a topical podcast on a specific thing where you are now, say, delivering information to your audience, maybe you're a rheumatologist talking about inflammatory disorders or something. If you can teach something and you're teaching it via podcast, I guarantee you're going to learn and understand how to communicate that topic better. And if we're doing like what we're doing, where you're doing interviews, and I'm kind of interested on your take on this, is when you have been doing interview after interview after interview, you get sort of a flavor where you can start, you see the dance between the person. And I would like to see how if you've taken this into your pre-ops or post-ops, and how is it that you actually interact with your patients in anesthesia now? Have you noticed that's changed your dialogue? Are you perhaps listening different, responding differently, hearing things in different ways? Because I could see that would be a benefit as well.
Yeah, so I think it definitely does. Like I said, especially for somebody like myself who is more of an introvert by nature, getting in front of somebody. My podcast is interview based, so just about every week I'm talking to somebody, and like you said, your ability to communicate with somebody, to draw out information, to hear, to maybe hear something that was unspoken, and figure out a way to dig deeper, gently dig deeper. That stuff is important, right? If you're taking a history with the patient, they say something, and maybe it was the way they said it, or maybe it was body language, or or just their intonation in their voice, and all of a sudden you may not have picked that up before, but you're like, oh, tell me a little bit more about that, what happened there. So I think there's definitely, when you're a better communicator, right, like that's going to work across the board. And I think being a better communicator is not just speaking better, right? I think you alluded to this, it's also listening better. And I've seen people do their podcast different ways. Like what I'll do is I'll set like a set of questions to my guests, and those are kind of like, hey, this is kind of what we're thinking about, but we can go down other rabbit holes. It doesn't mean that everything is just kind of set in stone, or just robotic or anything like that. But I have found that when I have those questions kind of set up as a roadmap, I can pay closer attention to my guests. And so a lot of times, I'll listen to an answer and say, okay, this is interesting. I didn't think we were going to talk about this, but let's go down this path a little bit. And that's a lot of times when you uncover some really interesting and golden insights, for sure.
Yeah, I like those. Well, kind of like I threw on you too. That just some of the unspoken things that are hidden between, the lines that we speak of. I think those resonate with people in a way that makes them more curious. But I do like the idea of what you said there too, is just freeing up your mind to listen better by not being distracted by what's the next question. And I mean, there's a real, I think, good it's good wisdom to be prepared in that way, so you can really enjoy the conversation a lot better.
Yeah, and it may be a little bit sorry to cut you off, but it may be a little bit personality driven, but for me, I found that works really well. Is I can listen so much better when I'm not thinking about what's kind of the next thing on the list. The list is there. We'll get to the next thing when we get to it, but I can listen a lot better and really get to to the important stuff.
Yeah, I know that there's definitely something that the audience, knowing that even for me, I know Kevin and I have tried to look at the resources available when you want to become a podcaster, and those are the technical things you said that can slow people down too, not just the equipment, but what am I going to use, maybe from what setup you have. Not just that, but like, where are you going to put the podcast so they get everywhere? Is there any particular resources just to give a starting place, even though those aren't the most critical, but you need to have somewhere to start?
So I'll break down my advice kind of like this. I think number one, starts with the mindset, and be prepared. I don't know what the exact percentage is, but so many podcasts fail before they hit 20 episodes. So go in with the mindset of creating at least 20 episodes, and whether that means listing 20 people that you might interview, or listing out 20 topics that you're going to talk about in your podcast. But go in with the mindset that I'm going to hit at least 20, and that unless you're somebody that has a massive following, or you have a massive email list or something like that to start with, it's probably going to be crickets at first, and you're going to have to do a lot of work to kind of build up an audience. It's probably going to be a lot harder than you think. So go in with that low expectation, and then anything better than that is just going to be gravy. So that would be my number one tip. Number two is kind of the stuff that we alluded to earlier on clarity. You really want to get clear on what your podcast is about. Get clear on your avatar, get clear on the format, and also your publishing schedule. Your podcast audience is going to come to expect your podcast to be out at a certain time. My podcast goes out every Monday morning. If it doesn't go out every Monday morning, you're probably going to get an email or a couple of emails. Hey, what happened? You kind of train your audience to expect it at a certain time, and, they'll forgive you. You miss it once, but you start missing 2 or 3 in a row, then they're probably going to go away. You're going to lose that audience that you've worked so hard to gain. So those would be my 2 big pieces. And then after that, figure out if you want to spend money or if you want to spend more of your time. If you're somebody who's either a med student or you just have a bunch of time, then you're going to be free to kind of, Google and YouTube a bunch of videos and articles and kind of figure it out a little bit more slowly. But if you're somebody who's like an attending, who's busy like I was, then kind of the medium road would be something like a course. If there's somebody who creates a course, like I did Pat Flynn's course, Smart Passive Income. I'd been following him for a number of years. I knew he was a trustworthy guy who had a successful podcast. And so I took his course, and that basically was for me one of the tipping points that allowed me to go from having nothing to basically publishing my podcast. Some people, even something like that is not enough for them, and they want kind of a done for you solution. And so there are podcasting services that will basically take you from idea phase, sit down with you and talk and help you flesh out your ideas, what you're going to name your podcast, what your branding and your logo is going to be, all the way to walking you through all of the equipment that you're going to need to buy, to doing all the post-production stuff, and basically hand you your first several episodes. And with the Doctor Podcast Network, we're going to have the ability to do that for people that are interested. Not cheap. That's probably the most expensive model, but it just depends on what you value more. There's no right or wrong answer. I know friends that have done it both, all of those ways. And it all depends on what you want. So I would say, depending on where you are on that spectrum, will depend on the resources that you're going to look for. But definitely get clear on the mindset, and having a clear idea of what you want to podcast about first.
Kevin?
Well,
I'm taking all the questions. So.
I think that was
a mouthful.
Yeah.
but it brought a lot of great points again. And I guess just to kind of add on to that a little bit, you talk about the mindset and the clarity, which is so important. And it's really, if you figure that out and you have that planned out, I guess I would just recommend people to invest that resource in such a way that you're going to optimize whatever the process or the process would be. Because like you were basically saying, if I know your podcasting network, which is coming out, or actually is out now by the time this episode is out, having a service that can help you through that process. The advantage being as a physician is you have the income to do it. And then that allows you to focus on actually creating and delivering and creating the podcast itself. Not, you should be aware of all the other details, but then you can just, do I like making podcasts? Right. And being able to focus on that in such a way that you can put 100% of your energy into it. I think that makes a lot of sense, where you're, sparing yourself all the other misery that goes with trying to Google all this information, like you said earlier. That all being said, is there anything, and we've covered so much, I'm trying to answer your question for you, but is there anything that now that you had wished you'd known then, like just before you were starting your podcast, or maybe you're just recording your first episode, or in that kind of process where you've already committed, but what do you know now that you wish you knew then?
Yeah, so probably 95% of the stuff that we just talked about now is stuff related to how to create a podcast, correctly or the right way or the most efficient way or something like that. That is very important, right? That's like step one. But when I got started, I wasn't really paying attention to the next couple steps. And the next couple steps are, how do you grow your podcast? And then how do you monetize your podcast? And those things you might think, well, monetization is not that important. Well, it is important because, you can only be doing something for so long if it's costing you money before you'll give up. And number two, that podcast starts making money. There's a lot of good that you can do with that. Some people donate a portion of their proceeds to charity and do a lot of good or what have you. So what I wasn't really thinking a lot about when I launched, because I was so concentrated, like most people, on how to create, is you really have to start thinking about how you're going to grow your podcast, how you're going to monetize your podcast. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. I'll kind of leave you with one last tip, but one of the best ways to grow your podcast is to be on other podcasts. And that's one of the reasons why I think a lot of people were really interested in this network, because we're focused on a network that has podcasts that have a physician audience. And so we'll be able to kind of lift all boats, so to speak, by cross-promoting each other, being guests on each other's shows and stuff like that. So if you have a podcast or you're thinking about creating one and you're going to think about how you're going to grow it, one of the great ways to do that is to think about other podcasts that are within your niche, maybe physician related, maybe not, depending on what your topic is. And you're going to want to go there. If there's Facebook groups, you're going to want to go there and not spam them with your podcast link, but be somebody who is actually helpful, right? When you are actually helpful and give people good information, thoughtful comments, then people will naturally look you up and try and find out who you are. And so that's kind of the things that I wish I had thought about more when I started, is kind of those next couple of steps, because they are important for your longevity and success.
Yeah, you made me think about, a lot of times people think there needs to be this competitive nature, or like, just let yourself rise and whatnot. But when you think about people who like read books, just because you recommend a different book, it doesn't mean they're not going to read somebody else's book. People are trying to ingest a lot of information from different sources. And the unique thing with the podcast and this audio version, people can consume this information, like you said, many times 80% or more of what you're saying. But there's the collaborative aspect. The beauty of us, if you're interviewing people, is that you start creating new friends. And it's like, it just breaks the ice so easily when you've agreed to do an interview. You get to know people naturally through these conversations, and you start building a community, you start building your tribe, and you just start, it just organically happens. And even when I was doing some other things that were interviewing, not necessarily for a podcast, but for a website, online community, you just start expanding across the world with people that are like-minded or interesting. And so I think that's another unspoken thing, is that you start creating connections, and your social circle just starts expanding.
Yeah, for sure. That has been one of the huge benefits that I wasn't really anticipating going in, like, especially, my show being interview based, like you guys have people on here as well, is, having an electronic Rolodex, so to speak, of, over 100 people and really accomplished people. Like, I've got, CMOs of billion-dollar companies, 7-figure bloggers, US congressmen, those are some pretty big people that not only have I been able to learn from, but I have their information at my fingertips and I can reach out to them if I needed to. To kind of piggyback on what you said, Dr. Cady, I have had the opportunity with my podcast to do some good things for people behind the scenes, whether that is connecting them with somebody else, which is a really cool thing. When you're a podcast host like this, you can connect people with other podcasters or whatnot, or just be helpful when people email you with information or with questions, regardless of things that you're an expert in. And when you do those things, and there's no expectation, I'm not doing it because I expect anything from that person. But when you do that, I've found that more times than not, like, something just serendipitously comes down the road, either because they want to connect you to somebody that really helps you out and helps you grow your podcast even bigger, or they think of you for a spot, they connect you to a sponsor. Hey, I was really thinking about you for this. And all of a sudden you're like, wow, like I was not even expecting that. So, it really does put you in a position to connect with people, to just be helpful, like you said, being collaborative. And I have found so many benefits from doing that, without even, you're not even doing it for that reason, but the benefits just kind of show up later on.
Yeah. Know, like, and trust. I mean, you're essentially allowing people to start connecting, understand your voice and your commitment to what you're doing. And it just takes it to another level.
Yep.
And so different than some things in medicine. This was reminding me, like, we had some conversations. I think it was like Jen Tang, and she's like, because she went to it was a previous guest, and she was a really competitive medical school, and she's like, how everybody was awful, and then she's doing something else, so everybody's nice, and this is like similar to that. Is like in podcasting and a lot of these internet spaces is the more you give, the more you get, right? And it's just the fun thing about it is the more you share, and people get worried about you're at your audience. But the fact of the matter is everybody has a unique voice. There's however many billion people in this world. So it's almost what you can consider an infinite audience. And so there's just so much great opportunities to collaborate and have some fun discussions like this one. It's always fun to talk.
And I keep coming back to the network, but just to give you an example, we've gone to advertisers and we've said to them, hey, like, because for them, some of them will have a cutoff, and, if the podcast is too small, they won't necessarily advertise, because it's, creating the invoices, sending the money, tracking everything. For a bunch of small podcasts, they're like, we're not really interested in doing that unless they hit a certain size. So we've come up to them and said, hey, what if you could do this all in once, in one fell swoop, and then you'd be able to have access to this network of podcasts. They're like, oh yeah, we're definitely interested in that. So now we allow podcasters that are smaller, more niche. Maybe they just haven't grown yet, or maybe they just have a very niche topic that is not going to see thousands and thousands, of downloads. And now they're able to monetize quicker, not only because the podcasting network helps them grow, but because they can have access to a monetization source before they would hit a certain size. So, collaboration definitely works. You just have to be creative. There is obviously a lot of work putting all that stuff together and reaching out and figuring all that stuff out. But it's exciting. It's exciting to do it kind of in this physician space, kind of how I don't think it's quite been done before. So it's pretty cool.
And it's needed. I guess that's the other thing, is it's really needed. And I think we talked about either on our episode or other previous episodes, the fact of the matter is social media, podcasting, whatever, is not going away. And rather than complain about what's being sourced out there, which we're seeing, I'm going to assume we're probably still in the middle of the COVID thing when this comes out, because I don't see that changing anytime soon. But just seeing this information is getting distributed, we have an opportunity as physicians to really put our voices out there in such a way. And podcasting is it's such a great way to do it, to produce good information that helps people and to collaborate with others on the way. So, David, awesome to have you on. And Melissa, do you have any other questions or last words, final word?
The only thing I was thinking is just how we can't all do this by ourselves, and collaborating, and we really need to have an interdependent kind of type community, and podcasting is a great opportunity for it. And success, really, when you think about it, is based on relationships, and it's just another great way of connecting and building relationships. Yeah,
for sure. And I just want to thank you guys really quick for allowing me to be a repeat guest. You guys are going to get sick of me here pretty soon, but no, just compliment you guys. You guys do the co-host thing. You guys pull it off really, really smoothly. So I just want to give you guys some props for doing that. And how cool is technology? I think we've got 3 people in 3 different cities coming together for a podcast that will be available across the globe. Isn't other than the pandemic and kind of the crap of this year, isn't 2020 awesome?
It is.
Hindsight's 2020. That's what they say. But David, really, if people want to learn more about what you're doing, where would you recommend, other than obviously your podcast? Would you have a direct connect or somewhere they can find you?
Yeah, I mean, so Doctors Unbound, you can always find me there. That's the podcast. And now we are launching the Doctor Podcast Network. So by the time this goes out, the network should be launched. You can either check out drpodcastnetwork.com. We will probably have at least some kind of beta version of a website up at that point. Or you can connect with me at david@drpodcastnetwork.com.
Is that DOCTOR or DR? Doctor pod? Like how did?
Yeah, it's spelled out Doctor. Thank you for clarifying.
All right.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, I will go ahead and do the outro. We're always battling that. Well, for those that are listening, I'm Dr. Melissa Cady with the Change Physician Podcast with my co-host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro, and our awesome guest that you just heard from, Dave Draghinas, and I'm sure we'll hear from him again in the future. And until next time, you all take care.
Stay well.
Take care.